Welcome to Win the Future, a podcast where we chat with folks who are tackling the most significant challenges our communities face today to make for a better tomorrow. I'm your host, Brett Broster. Hello and welcome to Win the Future. This is episode 6, and we are here with the one and only state representative for a little while longer.
Yeah.
Jesse MacLachlan, welcome.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you for coming. Today we're going to talk a little bit about psychedelics and the role it can play in helping with our mental health crisis.
Sure.
Which I think is incredibly important always, but specifically in the midst of COVID when a lot of people are isolated and struggling. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
I think we had a sense that, at least for me personally, that mental health care was starting to kind of come into the forefront. People started to come forward. Celebrities started to talk about struggles with depression. You saw some more prominent people in mainstream kind of opening up about the topic and talking about wellness. And nootropics got really big. For those listening, nootropics being basically vitamins 2.0. Cognitive enhancing supplements. But we're seeing some of the most respected research organizations in the United States produce really incredible data showing the potential for psychedelics to play a really important role in helping us as a society treat long-standing mental health disorders that until recently we haven't made any sort of significant breakthroughs in how we treat mental health disorders in decades. If you were to ask someone who may be prescribed, a pharmaceutical, they're probably looking at SSRIs as the most effective prescription drug, and they have pretty relatively low success rates to treat depression, anxiety, PTSD, and the data coming out of organizations like Hopkins and NYU for, amazingly enough, for psychedelics has been considered a breakthrough status by the FDA.
So what got you interested in exploring this issue?
Trying to sort out my own head several years back. I just started to, I realized that I was doing things to self-medicate, and I started asking myself, well, why am I doing these things? And the answer really had to do with the fact that, I was living with undiagnosed pain, emotional, mental pain. Didn't really understand it. And it started a journey of exploration that brought me into cognitive behavioral therapy and into, conversations, an exploration of, metacognition, thinking about how I think and where certain behavioral patterns are coming from and the emotions that cause them and the underlying belief systems behind those emotions. And I started researching and stumbled upon the work being done to research psychedelics, and found that research to be quite compelling.
And I know that there are some states, some cities that have already looked at this. What are a couple of those? Sure.
In this field, there are a number of ways to think about this. So you have, decriminalization, which is basically putting the substance at the bottom of the list of priorities for law enforcement. And then legalization. So the city of Denver has moved to decriminalize. And actually there's a ballot initiative in Oregon to medically legalize psilocybin medical therapy. And psilocybin being the active ingredient in psilocybe mushrooms, or as they're more colloquially known, as magic mushrooms. It's going to be on the ballot tomorrow. We'll see what happens. Johns Hopkins University right now is undergoing clinical trials for the impact of psilocybin on a number of disorders. They've already conducted one trial on the impact of nicotine addiction and have seen far superior results than on the compared to the nicotine patch. This wasn't a double-blind study where there's a placebo involved. This was a open label. So all the patients are given psilocybin and under the supervision of a doctor, a clinician, and they check back 6 months to see how they're doing. And at the 6-month mark, they had a 57% success rate of heavy smokers who are no longer addicted to nicotine, as opposed to a 25% success rate for traditional nicotine patches.
Wow. And I know that we've talked a little bit about how alcohol is being treated by using psychedelics. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So NYU, back in 2015, began a study for the impact of psilocybin on alcoholism. And I recently connected with one of their subjects, young man, early 30s, Wall Street professional. I don't think he would mind us using his name. He was on 60 Minutes with Anderson Cooper, John Costacopoulos, and he was an alcoholic, 20 drinks a day, tried everything. His doctors told him he had, a couple years to live before his organs started to shut down because of his lifestyle. And he enrolled and was accepted by the Hopkins program and underwent a few sessions with psilocybin. And for those listening, that's what that looks like is you sit down in like a living room with your clinician, having gone through, some basic talk therapy, and they put the headband, the sleep mask on you, and listen to some music that you picked out beforehand, and the psilocybin is administered, and they have an experience for about 4 or 5 hours, and things come up, and then there is post-session, therapy time between doctor and patient. And he hasn't had a drink since. He hasn't wanted a drink since. And he has devoted his career now to advancing the study and the adoption of psychedelics as a mental health treatment.
That's incredible.
It's really powerful.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really powerful.
And then I know that fighting PTSD is one of the main pieces that psychedelics have been researched in terms of their utilization in a medical capacity. Can you talk a little bit about that? Sure.
So, you can't talk about psychedelics without in their medical application without bringing up Rick Doblin and MAPS. So MAPS was started in the mid 80s by a gentleman by the name of Rick Doblin, and they're a nonprofit organization, and they've been working to fund research to study the impact of particularly MDMA and its impact and effect on patients with PTSD. Recently, the FDA actually granted MDMA and psilocybin breakthrough status for their ability to combat mental illness, mental health disorders. But as far as PTSD goes, the implications and ramifications that psilocybin can have, or psychedelics in general can have on patients with PTSD is it's compelling. So right now, 20 veterans a day currently commit suicide. And there's a growing movement happening particularly to help veterans by opening up access to psychedelic therapy. So the Heroic Hearts Project, which was started by a Army Ranger who served multiple tours in Afghanistan, came back and suffered from PTSD from the things that he had to go through, and found treatment in South America in a traditional a traditional South American ceremony. In this case, it was with ayahuasca, which is a preparation of a tea that contains the active ingredient dimethyltryptamine, which is a psychedelic. And it helped him radically transform his life and helped rewire the negative feedback loop that was causing so many problems in his own personal life. He has since started the Heroic Hearts Project to advocate for opening up those opportunities for other veterans who unfortunately can't seek that traditional care with a clinician in the United States because psychedelics are considered Schedule I narcotics, which means they have a high likelihood for addiction with no medical benefits. I think the data is showing that both of those things are false. More people overdose from opioids every day than really have ever overdosed from psilocybin mushrooms. And after you do them, you talk to these patients after they go through a session, they're not looking for another session. So we're talking about a truly disruptive contribution to the mental health field.
Wow.
Yeah. And it turns out it's thousands of years old.
That's incredible. Well, hey, Jesse, we're going to take a quick break. We're here with Jesse MacLachlan, and we will be back for the second part of our show in a few minutes here. Win the Future is sponsored in part by Connecticut by the Numbers. All right, everybody. Thank you for staying tuned. We are back for the second segment here with Jesse MacLachlan. Thanks for sticking around. And Jesse, I know both of us have struggled with our own mental health, and both have gone through cognitive therapy and continue to. Do you want to talk a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. Yeah, I'm an enthusiastic proponent and supporter of therapy. I never thought I'd say that, let alone on a podcast. But we're supposed to go to a primary care doctor once a year to get a checkup for every other part of our brain. And for some reason, as a society, we don't really extend the same courtesy to our minds as far as the treatment we get, whether for the stigma around it or for the fact that it's so dang expensive to talk to a therapist. In 2017, it became abundantly clear to me that, it's not natural to kind of go into a hole for a couple weeks at a time. Emotionally, as far as my communication goes, kind of shutting down in a lot of ways. And it took, being in a relationship with my, now girlfriend, who kind of pointed out that it's kind of weird and not natural that I was sort of shutting down and kind of disappearing mentally and emotionally speaking for weeks at a time. And I thought that was just something that people do. Right. And so luckily found a therapist, and it was one of the best decisions in my life. And I wish I had started going years ago. But I think the expectation, I think the picture that we have in our heads of therapy is sort of like laying on a couch talking about why and how mom and dad, hurt you as a kid. And cognitive behavioral therapy is not that at all.
Yeah, game changing.
Right. Yeah. It's closer to what I would call like mindfulness,
Yeah.
what the Roman philosophers would probably call stoicism, but being cognizant of how you think and of the constant narrative, realizing that there's a narrative going on in your mind at all times and that it's influencing the way that you emotionally respond to external stimuli and which governs actions. And it's about sort of taking control of that narrative and challenging that narrative when it becomes self-destructive, and doing so with logic and reason.
Definitely. The mindfulness piece is key. And I know meditation is something that we both explored and utilized. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you've used that?
Sure. Very, just I've taken a really sort of basic, and I try to take a utilitarian approach to meditation, in the sense of I have an ongoing narrative in my head. Let's say it's you suck. Let's take that one as a perfect example. To combat that, what I'll try to do is I'll take 5 seconds throughout the day. I'll just take a deep breath, choose a different script. So if I'm feeling like financial stresses are getting me down, I'll take a deep breath and remind myself that I live in abundance. If I feel like I'm screwing up and I'm getting down on myself for that, I take 5 seconds and I just remind myself that that I'm capable, and that life isn't about not making mistakes. Mistakes are part of experience, and experience is one of the fundamental components of learning. And that's what life is about, learning and improving. So little things like that to try to rewire my brain and replace a destructive script with a constructive script.
What advice would you give to somebody who's at home right now, struggling and worried about the stigma around seeking therapy or exploring options to help that aren't destructive?
Yeah, I would say that it's that everyone, to varying degrees, has their own mental health journey. Some are not as fortunate as others, in the sense of the internal narrative is harsher, but talking to someone is responsible, and there's no shame in taking control of your own mental health care life and seeking the help of a professional. That's what doctors are for. They are trained to help people like us who aren't trained navigate our bodies and our minds.
No, understood. And that's a great point. Great advice.
You've been through it. What would you say?
What I give?
Yeah. What would you say? You've been through the ringer on this whole.
I think being kind to yourself and making sure that you understand it's okay to take action, and that it doesn't have to be a significant action. It's kind of like getting back into the gym, or currently getting back into the gym is not very healthy or safe, but it's like getting back into exercise or getting back into writing. And so I've got one last question for you, kind of bringing it back to psychedelics.
Sure.
I know that psychedelic use for mind expansion and for the journey that brings back quants or analysts to end up having this sort of superpower or real superpower. Can you talk a little bit about that trend and how that plays into kind of the issue?
Yeah, there's Silicon Valley is really into. I think what you're talking about is microdosing. Yeah, so Silicon Valley started taking up microdosing of LSD. And for those listening, microdosing is taking a very small amount of a psychoactive, in this case, a psychedelic, where there are no immediate noticeable side effects. The person doesn't trip, but there are more latent sort of background effects, sustained creativity, a faster time getting into flow state. I mean, how would you define flow state, by the way?
Hitting stride, being in the zone. Those rare times where you find yourself so plugged in that you can't lose focus, and it is completely a positive experience. It's not very succinct, but
no, and people fight really. I mean, there are podcasts, plenty. God, if there's one podcast on it, there are. But no offense, but just particularly on,
no, I totally
particularly on flow state, right?
Yeah.
So these Silicon Valley guys, they're, and they've put a lot of money into it too. So, the Johns Hopkins University down in Baltimore opened the very first center dedicated to psychedelic research. And that was funded largely from private grants syndicated amongst Silicon Valley donors, organized by Tim Ferriss. And so this space is attracting institutional capital. In Canada, where the laws are a little different, there are a couple of companies that have already been publicly listed on the Canadian Stock Exchange with the intention of synthesizing psychedelic therapies. And they've already been valued at over $1 billion a piece. So the investment community already sees the writing on the wall that's coming from the data being produced by Hopkins, by NYU, by Berkeley. And we're looking at the disruption of a $80 billion a year global industry.
Wow. Interesting. So in terms of Connecticut, how do you see the future looking for the industry in a sense of what could happen short of legalization in the future?
Connecticut's a funny place because in some ways we're progressive as far as reproductive rights go, or in the way that we move to legalize gay marriage. But we're also kind of Puritan in the way that we approach controlled substances. And I think what stakeholders in Connecticut need to be convinced of is that psychedelics are not a toy or a drug to be played with, but rather a powerful medicine. And so I think our state will benefit by closely watching the data as it's produced by some of these research institutions, and let that speak for itself, because we are all in agreement that we're experiencing a mental health crisis. We're all in agreement that that the country, let alone Connecticut, is in an opioid epidemic. Hopkins has plans to run trials on, I believe, psilocybin's effect on opioid addiction. I believe they're looking at psilocybin. This is Roland Griffiths and down at Hopkins. Dr. Matt Johnson pioneered the tobacco work down there, but he's also looking at psilocybin's impact on PTSD. We have plenty of veterans in Connecticut. Veterans are some of the most underserved people groups, in our communities, particularly on this issue of mental health care and addiction treatment. We owe it to them. We owe it to the people who are experiencing, the disease of mental illness, to at least be open-minded and listen to science.
Definitely. Well, Jesse, I can't thank you enough for your time. Any last words you want to give to the audience? Man, by the time this airs, the elections will be over. So, otherwise, I would say exercise your right to vote, and try to get outside as much as possible. Get sunshine, get exercise, and be kind to yourself. Love it. Well, Jesse, always a pleasure. Thank you so much. Episode 6, Jesse MacLachlan. And please stay tuned for another episode of Win the Future. Thank you for listening to the Win the Future podcast, sponsored by the strategic communications firm, A Better Campaign. Make sure to visit our website at abettercampaign.com/win the future. Please don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts, and share it with your friends. Thank you for tuning in. Please tune in again next Thursday for another episode of Win the Future.